So let's have a look at muscle tissue. This is basic, very, very basic physiology. I'll have the sparkling, I think. Basic physiology going back to, first year at college is how muscles contract. But we have to remember the heart is a muscle. It's a very powerful muscle, and it operates very similarly to skeletal muscle, but there's one subtle difference, as we'll see. So skeletal muscle, that's the muscle that makes up our movements of voluntary, is composed of long, thin cells known as muscle fibers. They are enclosed in a structureless outer coat called the sarcolemma. So we have hundreds or thousands of fibers within muscle tissue, and the muscle tissue is covered with a structureless outer coat called a sarcolemma. They are striated, that means they've got stripes in them. They show alternate dark and light bands along their length. So if you look at them lengthways, you've got light, dark, but it's a little bit more complex than that. So here's our muscle fibers, and covered with the sarcolemma around the outside. And there's our bands, so we've got our dark band, as we'll see, and our light band, which makes it striated muscle. Now within the dark band here, A, on each side, there's a light area, which is I. And within the A, the dark band, is a paler part, just to make life confusing. And this is because it's made up of different proteins. And in the light part, the I band, is a dark part called the Z. And then we repeat all the way across. Now the Z is the important part because this is the real working area. So what's going to happen when the muscle contracts is the muscle shortens between the Z bands. So each fibre is made up of a large number of myofibrils. So a muscle fibre has hundreds of myofibrils, or small fibres. They are known as A bands and I bands. So the A is the dark, I is the light. At the centre of the dark is a light area, and at the centre of the light is a dark area. The area between the Z bands is the contractile unit, or sarcomere. Okay, so that's what we said. So here we see the Z band here, and here's the sarcomere. So it's this part in the Z bands, between the Z bands, that we get our contraction. The Z bands become close together during contraction. When the muscle fibers contract, the I band shortens, but the A band remains constant. Muscle is composed of two major proteins, actin and myosin. Myosin is confined to the A band. Actin filaments run from the Z band to terminate in the H zone. Striated muscle is built up of two overlapping series of filaments. The cross bridges exist between the actin and the myosin, allowing the fibers to move over each other. So again, here we see the myosin is the part here where we do the contraction. Now, what makes the muscle contract? And this is the exciting bit, the rest is theory, isn't it? What makes that muscle contract? And that's simple, like what makes the body work is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So we have a lot of mitochondria, or powerhouses, within muscle tissue. Okay? The reason for this is the muscles work a lot. Some muscles never stop. Okay? There's one muscle in the body that works all the time. Anybody know which one that is? The heart, yes, good, excellent. As well as the heart, there's another muscle which never switches off, interestingly, but is always firing a little bit somewhere. And that muscle is the supraspinatus muscle, because it rests the shoulder whichever way, even if you're in bed resting, it's still at an angle and it's having to go. And interesting, supraspinatus in applied kinesiology is associated with the brain, isn't it? Okay. So there may be a link there that the brain actually doesn't go to sleep either. It goes into subconscious mode. So ATP is produced in large numbers. So the muscle cell has lots and lots of mitochondria. Most cells in the body only have one mitochondrial powerhouse, but muscles have a lot because it needs to create a lot of ATP. But it doesn't have as many mitochondria as the nerve. The nerve has even more because the nerve works harder than the muscle. So when you get tired and your ATP level drops down, the first place you're going to see tiredness is within the nerve. So the nerve won't fire properly, okay, because that's the job of the nerve, isn't it, to fire. And one of the places we'll see that is the heart, because the heart has these amazing nerves which fire at incredible speeds from one node to another and then down the bundle and then round the Purkinje fibers into the muscle tissue. So when we see just fractions of a second when it doesn't fire at the same side at the same time at each side, and then you get a valve shut before the other one. So the amazing thing with the phonocardiograph, you can see all this on the phonocardiograph, but you can't hear it. It would be a real expert to be able to hear a bundle branch block. Okay? You can see it and you think, now I know this is a misfiring, okay? And there's lots we can do about it, but it's very, very difficult to pick it up just with a stethoscope. So the advantage of the phonocardiograph. Now, ATP enters into the cell and will allow a magical substance to enter in there which is involved with the contraction of the muscle. And that substance is called calcium. Okay, so we hear a lot about calcium, don't we? Calcium plays a key regulatory role in the muscle contraction. Actin-based regulation occurs in the skeletal and cardiac muscles. Now, this is the difference, okay? So between ordinary skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle, like skeletal muscle, is striated. In other words, it has these A and I bands, but exhibits intrinsic rhythmicity. That means it can contract on its own, to its own orders. And as we'll see, those orders are given by the pacemakers and can, in the event of real severe heart failure, actually be instigated within the muscle tissue itself. In cardiac muscle, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is less extensive, and thus the intracellular supply of calcium for contraction is less, thus relying upon extracellular calcium for contraction. What it means is that skeletal muscle can use the calcium within the sarcoplasmic reticulum inside the muscle tissue and simply recycle it. So it goes into the muscle fiber, instigates that ATP then has to pump that calcium out, and so it goes round and round and round and round. But because the sarcoplasmic reticulum is less extensive in cardiac muscle, and that was what makes it really different, is it has to get the calcium for every contraction of the muscle fiber from outside the fiber. Okay? So calcium has to flow in and out of the muscle fiber. Okay? This is the key thing. Without calcium, the muscle can't contract in the heart. If deprived of extracellular calcium, the heart ceases to beat within 1 minute. Okay? This is your squash player, you know, who's out there, wham, 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 sweating like mad. All these mineral salts are going up, and then, okay? And they do an autopsy, and they find no coronary thrombosis at all, no embolisms, nothing. The heart has simply gone into contraction. And the person's died because the heart doesn't beat anymore. And this is a total lack of calcium. Now, there's another interesting part to this, of course, of what regulates. But remember, 1 minute, and it's lethal if you stop the calcium. In other words, the heart can't contract anymore. Calcium enters the muscle cells through voltage-regulated calcium-specific channels. Now, we've met in previous seminars about voltage channels. These are like entrance or ports of how calcium gets into the cell through the cell membrane. So these ports are open rather like a lock in a canal or a river. So the gates open, allow calcium to go in, like the ship to go in, and then it shuts. Okay? It doesn't stay open, otherwise calcium would influx all the time. And we know that calcium is primarily an extracellular mineral, so it has to be pumped back out. So it's like a switcher, the calcium, and it has to be regulated. And this regulation is through a voltage-gated calcium-specific channel, opening during depolarization, in other words, when the nerve comes down, induced by the spread of the cardiac action potential or from the pacemaker, activation of protein kinase enzymes which modulate the intracellular calcium are magnesium dependent. Okay? Many years I've taught you this, that all kinase enzymes in the body, and there's a lot of them, are magnesium dependent. So now we see we have to have calcium, but we have to have magnesium to control it. Okay, to regulate the influx or not of calcium depends entirely upon magnesium. So we know that anything to do with hearts and heart rhythms, the first thing you look at is calcium to magnesium ratios. Okay, so you have to have that absolutely right for the muscle tissue to fire. Now we find that most times people are pretty okay with calcium. Now there may be times when people are low in the diffusible forms of calcium because they have too much of the non-soluble forms like calcium carbonate or chalk. About probably 50% of the population are magnesium deficient. Okay. Now I mentioned before that probably we only absorb 1/3 of the magnesium that we eat from our food. So we don't absorb it all. Now magnesium comes primarily from leafy green vegetables. Okay? So magnesium is the core element within chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is almost identical to mammalian blood, hemoglobin, but in mammalian blood iron is the core, and in chlorophyll it's magnesium. So when people say, well, where do I get magnesium from? The answer is from leafy green vegetables. And the darker, in other words, the more chlorophyll they've got, the more magnesium. And naturally, the darker ones are the ones we throw away because they're a little bit bitter. So when you have your cabbage or whatever, you tend to discard those. But the best way to get round those is to make them into smoothies. So magnesium is also somewhat water soluble. So if you steam or you boil your cabbage, or your curly kale and things, most of the magnesium will be in the water. So remember that. And which type of magnesium will be in the water? The most soluble forms. And which types of magnesium does the body need? The most soluble forms. If you have the insoluble forms, like carbonates and oxides and things, are they going to get into your body? The answer is no. If they don't get out of the vegetable in the saucepan, they're not going to get out of the vegetable in your gut in the same way. So the most water-soluble forms of all minerals are the most important ones. And those are our friends. Those are the chlorides, the sulfates, and the phosphates. Okay? So this is the key bit here, that it's the water-soluble ones which are going to be the most beneficial ones. But could there be a type which is more suitable for Sam? Could there be one, Olivier might need a different type, and Anthony may need a third type, depending upon whether they're tall, medium or short, or other factors. Okay, so it could be that one person will benefit more from a sulfate, another one from a chloride, another from phosphate, another one couldn't care less what it is. Okay, but you don't usually find any other forms. Okay? Now if a person strengthens to citrate or one of these other forms, it's because they're not getting the right form in. Okay, citrates are not natural substances. Okay, they're very good and they're made in the body to get into the mitochondria, but you don't normally get magnesium citrate in nature. You get citric acid, which bonds with magnesium and makes citrates. The body can always make citric acid in the Krebs cycle, but the most natural forms are what you see on the water bottle. You know, the ministries of various people know what other ones you have to label in. They don't put citrates on here, do they? They put carbonates, they put phosphates, sulfates, and chlorides, because they're the most water-soluble forms that you find in water. And therefore that water is no different from your vegetable water. Okay? So when you throw your vegetable water away, that's you throwing all your good minerals and things down the sink as well. And many, of course, of your water-soluble vitamins are in there as well, like your folic acids and things. Okay, so most important bit here that we've learnt is that to regulate calcium, we need magnesium. So in other words, these are the enzymes which allow the calcium to go in and also help produce the energy to pump it out again. Calcium entry requires an optimal cell membrane integrity. That means the cell membrane, or the membrane of the mitochondria, has to be optimal in its consistency. And we know that all cell membranes are made of oils, aren't they? They're phospholipids is the word. And the phospholipid in cells is slightly different one cell to another. So we have a little bit more of omega-3 types of oils in some cells and a little bit more of omega-6 cells in other cells. So we know that all cell membranes contain one molecule of a saturated oil and one molecule of an unsaturated. And that unsaturated could be an omega-3 or it could be an omega-6, etc., etc. But we know in the brain, in nervous tissue, both chains here are unsaturates. And the predominant one of those will be DHA in the frontal cortex and certain other glands in the body, like the adrenals and the gonads. So the difference between neurological tissue is that the phospholipids are both unsaturated. Okay? So that means that the nerve supply and the pacemakers in the heart act more like the brain. Okay? They need two unsaturated oils. Okay? But the cardiac muscle membranes is one saturated and one unsaturated. Okay, so the important thing is the integrity or the natural makeup of the phospholipids. The presence of trans fatty acids. Trans fatty acids are unsaturates which are heated. So every time we have a double bond in an unsaturated, we have a bend. So there's a kink. Okay, so it makes an angle here in the molecular structure. When you heat that fatty acid up to beyond 100 degrees centigrade, what happens is the molecule twists, okay? And as it twists, it straightens out. And that molecule then acts like a cis form. In other words, it acts like a saturated fatty acid. Okay, it's still got the double bond, okay, but it's twisted round, so it's straightened out. And we know that saturated fatty acids are straight chains, and they have higher melting points. So what happens with a trans fatty acid, which you obtain from a cis, is the cis will convert into the trans or alter and straighten out, and up will go its melting point. And if your melting point goes up, it makes you stiff, doesn't it? Okay? So A, you feel stiff, but B, your cell membranes are stiff. And if your cell membranes are stiff, they've got higher melting points, they're not going to allow the channels to work properly. All right? Now this is why, very slowly, they're beginning to realise that trans fatty acids is not good. And they're now advertising these foods are not with trans fatty acids. It's impossible. Every time you heat a unsaturated oil, you're going to develop trans fatty acids. The only good aspect of it is that the ones with single bonds don't raise the temperature melting point up so much as the ones with polyunsaturates. So polyunsaturates are much more vulnerable to being turned into trans fatty acids than monounsaturates. So that means olive oil and macadamia nut and single monounsaturates are better for heating purposes than your polyunsaturates, except for red people, because red people like olive oil, don't they? They like the omega-9s in there, are good for red people. So red people mustn't cook with olive oil, must they? Because they'll take up the trans form of the fatty acids, okay? The rest of us, greens and blues, can cook with olive oil. So do you remember what the red should cook with? Sunflower. Sunflower is good for nobody, okay, really. Nice oil, good for cooking, very light, a little bit of a polyunsaturated, but nobody takes up those oils, okay? They're practically useless, the fatty acids in there. I haven't found yet a person who's muscle tested to needing sunflower oil, okay? So you're pretty safe with using it once, and only once, to cook with. Now, there's another aspect of this wretched unsaturated fatty acid, and that is when they oxidize them. So the fatty acid could go rancid. Okay, this changes the structure as well. So you get an oxygen molecule added to it, and it gives it a completely different chemical property. So this would be your oil that's been left out for a while. This would be an unsaturated that you left the top off. Okay, usually you can smell it. Okay, if you remember in previous seminars, we've tested oils and how you test it by putting formic acid on the person, which is the byproduct of oxidation of unsaturated fatty acids. And remember, for a deficiency of fatty acids, the marker that we use, and I would recommend you use this very regularly with patients, is ethane. Ethane is a gas which is given off when we break down unsaturated fatty acids. And if that level is high, which you get in the ethane breath test, but we can use a vial of ethane and see if the person weakens to it, this is always indicative of an unsaturated fatty acid deficiency. Not just omega-3, could be omega-6, omega-7, omega-9, etc. Okay? But if they weaken to ethane, never forget that, because so many people do need their fatty acids, their right fatty acids. Because your chance of having fresh, non-rancid oils or oxidized oils and nothing being trans, you've got the other possible danger of a hydrogenated vegetable oil, okay? which is the second devil coming into the picture, is when hydrogen is pumped through to make a liquid become more solid, to make it spreadable as a margarine, etc. And this is now probably considered to be as bad as trans, if not even worse. Okay? So the combination of trans fatty acids and hydrogenated oils will really clog your heart up. There's no question about that. Okay, so thus the necessity for good organic, because all oils are extracted with chemicals like solvents like hexane. Okay? So organic ones are biologically in a different way. They're cold pressed and the oil is squeezed out. They're not got out by using chemicals. So organic, cold pressed, which means there's no heating in the process, so they shouldn't possess trans fatty acids. Unsaturated oils, such as the ones that we've supplied for the last couple of years, really. Flaxseed, really, really very good. We're looking at a number of other ones, but all the oils that the body needs. And what we know now, is that the different body types need slightly different oil combinations. Our blue types need more of the omega-3 oils from plant sources. Our red types need 3, 6 and 9. Okay, they're the ones who love the olive. And the greens are more of the omega-6s with less of the omega-3s. Okay? So we all have different requirements of different sort of fatty acids to express itself. So calcium entry requires optimal membrane integrity. So the two things here is to get the right oils up, and we need to stabilize the cell membranes, keep them all together. And to do that, we need pyridoxal 5-phosphate. So, Chris mentioned pyridoxal 5-phosphate earlier in relationship to red people, okay, having the polymorphism. So this again predisposes red people to not firing properly within the heart. So pyridoxal 5-phosphate, the active form of B6, is important in the stabilization of cell membranes. This allows calcium to get in. So for the muscle to contract, we need to get calcium in. To get calcium in, we need the optimal membranes, and we need the P5P to stabilize the membranes. So this is interesting, isn't it? Because we now know that we've got to get calcium as a single ion. So it's calcium plus plus. That means calcium ion. That does not mean calcium chloride, phosphate, whatever it might be, it is combined with. That's in a dry state. When you put those compounds into liquids, they dissociate. Okay, so calcium chloride in powder will be a compound. Calcium will be bonded with chloride. When you put it into liquid, calcium ions will go one way and chloride will go another way. Right? So they'll be dissociated, it's called, in solution. And of course the better solution, the better dissociation, will be the more soluble that compound is. So if you've got an insoluble compound like calcium phosphate, you don't want calcium phosphate, which is rich in our bones and our teeth, to be soluble, do we? Otherwise we'll dissolve during the day. Okay. So we need insoluble calcium salts in the firm parts of our body. But when we want to get calcium in the heart, we need a soluble form, don't we? We don't want to eat chalk, because that's relatively insoluble. We don't want calcium phosphate. We want something which is really ionizable, and we'll look at what those are a little later on. So low magnesium levels, which we just have been found to be the best predictor of heart disease, contrary to the traditional belief that cholesterol and saturated fatty acid play the biggest roles. So this is a marker for tendency towards cardiovascular disease, will be low magnesium. Okay? Doesn't mean that everybody's low magnesium will get heart disease, but it is one of the indicators, predisposing factors, which is probably why we find 50% of the population need magnesium of one form or another. Now, cholesterol does play a role. Everybody knows cholesterol, but it's mostly oxidized cholesterol. But when it's been oxidized or gone rancid, then it has to be taken out of the cell membranes and taken to the liver and then got rid of. So we're going to look at cholesterol briefly later on, of how the body gets rid of it and whether cholesterol is a marker for cardiovascular disease in our patient. Saturated fat is being played down. Saturated fats are much safer than what they first thought. Saturates can't get into the phospholipid position of an unsaturated. Okay? But an unsaturated can change its form, still be taken in the unsaturated position, but it can act as a saturate if it's heated and becomes a trans. Okay, so that's the difference. But a saturate can't get into an unsaturated, it doesn't have the key to lock onto the phospholipid structure. So saturated oils are not so bad. They do not change when they're heated, okay, because there's no double bonds to become oxidized. But what is a saturated oil? And this is the next thing. Animal fats tend to be saturated. Plant oils tend to be unsaturated, with a few exceptions. Now, the most notable exception is coconut oil. Coconut oil is a saturated, but it's 10% unsaturated. And this means that 10% will become oxidized and become a trans when you heat with it. Okay? Now, you know this because if you cook with coconut oil, it stinks the kitchen out. Okay? When you smell coconut oil, it's really nice and refreshing, and you think, that's nice, and even use it as a spread on your bread, etc. But when you cook with it, the whole permeates the whole place. That's it when it goes rancid. Okay, it's the unsaturated part. I don't recommend people use coconut for cooking. Use it for spreading. It's a great oil. It's fantastic, antifungal, all sorts of great properties to it. But I don't suggest you cook with it. Okay? You need to cook with an oil which your body doesn't take up. Okay, and you know those from previous seminars with the red, green and blue constitution, which are the good oils for you and which are the oils that you can cook. If in doubt, go for sunflower or a neutral oil or an animal oil. Research by Rosanoff and her colleagues conducted a detailed review of cardiovascular disease going right back to 1937. Research revealed low magnesium to be linked with all known cardiovascular diseases like hypertension, arterial plaque, calcification of soft tissues, cholesterol, hardening of the arteries. All fairly obvious to us in natural medicine that magnesium has, tremendous roles. 1957, low magnesium was shown to be strongly convincingly a cause of atherogenesis and the calcification of soft tissues. Obviously, because without magnesium, you're allowing calcium to enter into the cell, and it's not going to come out on its own. But this research was widely and immediately ignored as cholesterol and high saturated diets became the culprits to fight. I can remember this when heart disease was really prevalent in the 1950s and 1960s, and everybody moved towards vegetable oils. And you were persuaded not to eat saturated oils, and wicked things like butter were taken off the market, evil things like eggs because they contain cholesterol, etc. And you must eat vegetable corn oil. What they didn't tell you is it's already rancid and been heated in the whole extraction process, and it was 10 times worse than butter or lard or dripping or any of the other things. Now they're beginning to realise this 40 years later. Why are they realising it now? Because heart diseases continue to go up, not down, in spite of all the cholesterol managing drugs and things, that they now realise that cholesterol may be a factor, but it's only part of the big picture, and maybe it's due to something that people are eating. And maybe it's due to something that people are not eating, as we'll see. So there's many heart disease and many multifactorial. And one of the most important things is the oils, okay? And we'll see that before 1913, heart disease in this country was unknown, as far as coronary heart disease. The first recorded heart attack in this country was 1913, and the second one was 1917. Okay? So what's happened since then? Lots of things, and this is what we've got to look at. What is the difference there? Animals have been kept indoors much more during the winter, so their EPA, DHA levels have gone down. So we've got more of different types of fatty acids and less of the longer chain ones that keep us nice and flexible. We eat refined carbohydrates. Basically, people eat junk. Many people call heart disease white flour disease. Okay, so that's a big factor, as we'll see, because we're not getting the vitamin Bs and we're not getting the vitamin E, and we're getting rancid oils. We're heating vegetable oils. You can begin to see how we're clogging up